And thank you for staying with us. President Donald Trump is on the defensive. This after an explosive article released by the New York Times claiming the president evaded taxes for himself and his father, among several other allegations of illegalities and improprieties. Welcome now, Michael Benjamin, associate editor of the editorial, the associate editor of the editorial page of the New York Post. I should know that by now as much as we've talked to Mike. Mike, good to have you.
Glad to be on, Daren. Good morning. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing good, doing good. Let's get right at it. Let's talk about this new article coming out by the New York Times, really exposing President Trump, talking about these financial improprieties. The initial thought is the president was out on the campaign trail saying, listen, I got $1 million from my father. This is how I got my start. But after reading this article and what we found in this article, things are totally different.
Yeah, it appears to be, according to the Times report, seems that his dad, Fred Trump, engaged in some rather creative accounting to avoid inheritance taxes and to undervalue his properties. It doesn't look good. It doesn't look good for the Trump family, particularly now that New York State Department of Taxation and Finance says they will look into the matter to see if there was any tax fraud that went on, as apparently the Times story seems to allege. You know, one of the taxes that the Trump family may have been trying to avoid was the 55% inheritance tax. And so what the alleged scheme, according to the Times, involved with the creation of a shell company, some sort of a supply and maintenance company that would bill Fred Trump's companies for equipment and supplies at overly inflated prices. And I guess the excess would then be transferred to the Trump children as they could pocket without paying any inheritance taxes on. Yeah, and this scheme went on for a number of years, and it avoided a big lump sum that would have been taxable under U.S. inheritance laws.
Well, when we look at the president, I have some numbers here. By age 3, Mr. Trump was earning $200,000 a year, considerably in today's economy. By the time he was 17, he had part ownership of a 52-unit apartment building, and then he was receiving basically the equivalent of $1 million a year from his father to more than $5 million annually in his 40s and 50s. And for someone that has alleged that really he's come up by his own bootstraps, looking at these things with the inheritance tax and all this other stuff, where do we see this going? Because you see where he's come from, you see where he is, and we know the amount of bankruptcies. Former New York State Attorney General Eric Schneiderman said he was opening up an investigation. Can we expect even more coming out of the State Attorney General's office?
As I say, yes, State Attorney General's office. I'm certain that the governor has said he's directing his Department of State Taxation and Finance to look into the matter as well. Yeah, they're going to go back years, and they have subpoena power, and they could subpoena records from the Trump organization to see what exactly was filed, and was there an effort, as the Times seems to allege, to avoid taxes. And also, the Times talks about the article also innuendo that the fact was that Fred Trump used some of this overvalued supplies and renovation of his properties to then seek MCIs, major capital improvement credits, so he could then raise the rent on the renters in his building. And using those overinflated prices allowed him to raise the rents much higher than he normally would have been able to. And that could lead to reforms now that they have been talked about in the MCI program as a result of this bombshell report in today's New York Times.
Talking about the president, of course, he's on the defensive. Talking about the New York Times has put a hit out on him, and that the media is really, once again, attacking him. But one more reason for criticism comes out of his recent comments in South Haven, Mississippi, talking about Christy Blasey Ford, the lady that accused Supreme Court Justice nominee, Brett Kavanaugh, of sexual assault. The president actually mocking her. What do you think this does in terms of credibility for the president? Because there's one thing for sure, he does have a base, but even those people who are within his base, some people are cringing at this latest one.
Absolutely. I mean, it's hard to believe that President Trump has any sort of credibility with anyone in the United States, given his history of exaggeration, outright lies, his history of saying one thing one day and the next day changing his mind and saying something else. Over the weekend, last week, He was, supportive of Dr. Ford, saying that she ought to be heard and weight ought to be given to what she said. He said that her testimony in front of the Judiciary Committee was credible. And then, yes, last night he goes on a stage and he starts mocking her. There's something definitely wrong with the President of the United States when he behaves in that matter. And now I'm certain he's going to go off on a Twitter tirade against what he's calling the failing New York Times for what he's calling a hit on him. But they're using facts that are there, and there have been many questions about his taxes, and he is yet to release his own personal tax returns, as many past presidential candidates and presidents have done.
Yeah, I know some people talked about the fact that he's questioned former President Obama looking for a birth certificate and actually forced the president to produce his birth certificate. Many people are still questioning the fact of whether or not he will ever give his actual tax returns. I want to turn to another topic real quick, and I want to talk about the RFK charity. And, bring us up to speed with the RFK charity and some of these latest people who've been actually released through the RFK charity have been under scrutiny.
Yes, the Robert Kennedy Human Rights Foundation has started a bailout program that they've been running across the country. They're now bringing it to New York to highlight the deficiencies and injustice that's in the cash bail system. They put together a $5 million fund where they plan to bail out between 400 and 500 New Yorkers, primarily women and teenagers, who are held on cash bail at Rikers. The teenagers are now being held at youth facilities in the Bronx and Brooklyn. I believe they were able to free on bail about a dozen people on Monday. And the New York Post reports today that one of the freed offenders is a woman named Ralphie Myrie, who's been a sort of a violent robber, a thief. And she has a history of violent robberies and violence, but she was bailed out by the fund, and her latest victims are afraid that she may return and do harm to them. One of the reasons why she was held on bail is that the judge and the prosecutors believed that she was a risk, to not return to court. The fund, the idea is nice when you want to bail out people who are being held on charges that are not violent charges and are not dangerous to the community, and if their families can't meet a minimum bail of $2,500, then somebody ought to be able to help them to be free. Because I believe a person who's accused of a crime ought to be able to have bail or actually be released without bail, so they can regularly meet with their attorney and create a defense so that they can properly defend themselves and not wind up being forced to cop a plea because they want to do as little time as possible.
Yeah, and we talk about this, when we had the people from Cash Bail on, supporting the fact of, making sure that this cash bail reform was taken care of, that the big thing was those people who committed serious offenses, and if they were, with bail, they would be definitely remanded. But it seems in this particular case, a major ball has been dropped. How do you get to the place? Is there any discoveries? How did they get to the place with the discovery of how she was picked as opposed to others?
Well, her bail is $25,000, and any individual come forward and help her with her bail. Was able to put down, I guess, $2,500 to have her released on bail. The opposition and trouble, I guess, we have at the Post editorial board is that we're afraid that the RFK fund will be releasing people who could be our threat to the local community. And they're talking about releasing teenagers. Some of these teenagers are suspected violent offenders. Some of them belong to major gangs, like at Trinitarios, who murdered that young man in the West Bronx a few months ago. Mm-hmm. And you have other gang members belonging to the Blood, Crips, and other gangs that are violent. Yes, they're 16 and 17 years old, but they're being held on charges because they've done something to the community. They've injured people. They've robbed. They've created havoc, and they ought to be in a facility and not allowed to roam the streets, possibly doing crimes again while they're awaiting a trial. And that's been known to happen. People on bail have been known to commit crimes. But I do want to say, yes, the evidence has been that low-level offenders, people who've been arrested and then given bail, who are misdemeanor offenders, 95% have returned to jail or have returned for their trial. Persons who are suspected of violent felonies have a tendency to not return to return for their trial, and that's what's problematic.
Yeah, got to keep a close watch on that. We didn't get to talk about Mayor de Blasio's emails. We're out of time on this one. But listen, we'll get you back. Michael Benjamin, thank you so much for coming and sharing with us here on Open.
Yeah, thank you.
All righty, listen, we got more shows. Stay tuned. We'll be right back right after this.